Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubillos was born in Genova, in the interior of Colombia, on January 25, 1957. The eldest son of a family with 7 siblings, he grew up in a troubled home, experiencing mistreatment from his father and bullying at school. Additionally, he was harmed multiple times by 2 neighbors. He left home at the age of 16 and moved to a nearby city. He struggled to keep a steady job due to his aggressive behavior, often getting into conflicts with his employers. His most stable job was as a street vendor, selling religious statues and prayer cards. Facing difficulties maintaining a job and emotional stability, Garavito developed a dependence on alcohol by the age of 21. He even attempted to end his own life. He sought help from Colombia's social services, but the psychological support he received only addressed depression. However, he was dealing with far darker impulses. He had an urge to harm others. In 1992, at the age of 45, he finally acted on these urges. His preferred targets were young individuals between the ages of 8 and 16. He would approach them by offering gifts, small amounts of money, or asking for help carrying something. Then, he would lead them to a secluded area or wait until they became too tired to resist. Once alone, he would restrain his victims and subject them to extreme mistreatment. Afterward, he would physically assault them and use sharp objects to cause further harm. The fatal act was often inflicted on the neck, but in some cases, he went even further. To evade law enforcement, he constantly moved from place to place. Over 7 years, he traveled through 54 cities in Colombia and several in Ecuador, which still requests his extradition. He also changed his appearance and methods of approach, sometimes disguising himself as a doctor, monk, charity worker, or beggar. As authorities investigated the wave of disappearances, they even considered the possibility of a cult being involved. The height of the investigation came in November 1997 when a mass grave with 36 skeletal remains was discovered in the city of Pereira. Garavito became a suspect based on witness testimonies and hotel records. He was arrested on April 22, 1999, in Villavicencio while attempting to harm a 12-year-old boy. Authorities initially believed it was an isolated case, but he later confessed to taking the lives of 140 children and handed over a notebook detailing the locations and names of each victim. Estimates suggest the real number could be as high as 300. The criminal was convicted on 138 of the 172 charges against him, receiving a final sentence of 1,853 years and 9 days in prison. However, due to laws at the time, he could only serve a maximum of 30 years. His cooperation with authorities reduced his sentence to 22. In prison, he remains isolated from other inmates and only accepts food or water from trusted individuals. Pedro Alonso Lopez, known as the Monster of the Andes, is one of the most infamous serial criminals in Latin America. With a terrifying history of crimes and disappearances of young girls and teenagers in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, his story raises crucial questions about childhood, violence, and the effectiveness of the justice system in the region. Born on October 8, 1948, in the city of Espinal, Colombia, Pedro was the 7th of 13 children in a family struggling with severe social and economic issues. His mother, who worked in precarious conditions, fought to support her children in extreme poverty. From an early age, Pedro was exposed to an environment of neglect and hardship, which tragically shaped his psyche. At the age of 9, after being caught in an inappropriate act toward one of his sisters, Pedro was expelled from his home. This pivotal event had a profound impact on his mindset, leading him to live on the streets of Bogotá. Abandonment and lack of protection made him vulnerable to further mistreatment, perpetuating a cycle of violence that would follow him throughout his life. After being imprisoned for theft in 1969, Pedro endured severe mistreatment from other inmates, intensifying his feelings of resentment. This experience led him to develop a distorted view of suffering, drawing a connection between his own pain and the pain he would later inflict on others. His first crimes occurred shortly after his release, with Pedro targeting girls from vulnerable communities, often of indigenous descent. Studies on criminal behavior suggest that Pedro's choice of indigenous girls was rooted in a distorted perception of vulnerability. Many offenders select their targets based on the belief that they are easier to overpower and less likely to be noticed by authorities. This power dynamic reflects not only Pedro's psychology, but also the social failures that enable such crimes to occur. After a period of crimes in Colombia, Pedro moved to Peru, where his actions escalated. It is estimated that after his arrival in Peru, he harmed and took the lives of at least 100 girls. His brutality became notorious, and he became a fugitive. The social dynamics of the region, marked by impunity and the marginalization of indigenous communities, allowed Pedro to continue his actions for so long without being captured. In 1980, a river overflow in Ecuador revealed the remains of several missing girls, leading to a major investigation. This discovery shocked society and exposed the depth of violence against young girls in Latin America. Following extensive investigations, Pedro Alonso was arrested in 1980, with authorities gathering enough evidence to convict him. He was sentenced to 16 years in prison in Ecuador. However, his story did not end there. In 1994, he was extradited to Colombia, where he was placed in a psychiatric hospital. His release in 1998, after being deemed rehabilitated, raised critical concerns about the judicial system and the psychological evaluation of repeat offenders. After his release, Pedro sought out his mother to ask for money, but then completely vanished. Despite years of disappearance, his mother still believes he is alive, reflecting the pain and denial that surround his story. This belief, though unfounded, represents a mother's lingering hope for answers. Theodore Robert Cowell was born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont, United States. The son of Eleanor Louise Cowell, Theodore never knew his father. In 1951, Eleanor married Johnny Culpepper Bundy, who adopted Ted. Eleanor and Johnny had 4 more children, and despite their attempts to include Ted in family activities, he remained distant. In an interview with authors Stephen G. Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth, Ted stated that he chose to be alone during his youth because he did not understand interpersonal relationships. Considered an intelligent and promising young man, Ted had no trouble getting into college after high school in 1965. He spent a year at the University of Puget Sound before transferring to the University of Washington. In early 1968, he dropped out of college and started working temporary jobs. He also became involved in the Republican Party and volunteered for Nelson Rockefeller's presidential campaign. In 1967, Bundy became involved with a fellow student at the University of Washington, Stephanie Brooks. About a year later, she ended the relationship due to Bundy's immaturity and lack of ambition, leaving him devastated. After the breakup with Stephanie, Bundy traveled to Colorado and later to Philadelphia, where he enrolled for a semester at Temple University. He told attorney Polly Nelson that it was during this time, in 1969, that he attempted his first kidnapping. There is no consensus on when or where Bundy began harming women. He gave different versions to interviewers, psychologists, and attorneys and refused to provide details about his early crimes. The first documented incidents occurred in 1974 when Bundy was 27 years old. Bundy was responsible for the deaths of more than 35 women, including a 12-year-old girl. Most of his victims resembled Stephanie Brooks. They were young white women, generally under 25, from middle-class backgrounds, with long, straight brown hair. Ted Bundy was seen as a charming and persuasive man who could convince people of his innocence. These traits helped him gain the trust of his victims before attacking them. In 1975, Bundy was arrested by the Utah Highway Patrol. Inside his car, police found masks, surgical gloves, hammers, and garbage bags. A detailed search uncovered hair strands, fingerprints, and blood evidence linking him to several missing women. During a preliminary hearing in 1977 in Aspen, Bundy was allowed to remove his handcuffs to review legal books. He took the opportunity to jump from the second floor and run toward the mountains. After wandering for 6 days, he stole a car and returned to the city, where he was recognized and arrested again. On December 30th, 1977, most prison staff and nonviolent inmates were away for the Christmas holiday. Bundy arranged books on his bed and covered them with a blanket to create the illusion of a sleeping body. He then climbed through the ceiling into the chief jailer's office, who was absent, and put on his clothes before walking out the front door to freedom. After stealing a car, hitching a ride, and taking a bus, Bundy made his way to Denver, where he caught a flight to Chicago. By the time prison officials discovered his escape more than 17 hours later, Bundy had already arrived in Chicago. On January 8th, Bundy reached Tallahassee, Florida, where he rented a room under the alias Chris Hagen. A week later, in the early morning hours, he broke into the Chi Omega sorority house, where he assaulted and killed 4 students. On February 15, 1978, Ted Bundy was stopped by a police officer in Pensacola, Florida. After checking the license plate, the officer found that the vehicle was stolen and placed him under arrest, unaware that he had just captured a wanted criminal. At the police station, Bundy identified himself as Ken Meisner and presented stolen identification from the real Meisner. However, a thorough investigation revealed his true identity. Ted Bundy was tried in various courts in Florida, Utah, and Colorado. In each case, he insisted on representing himself. The press from multiple countries closely followed the trials. While evidence linked Bundy to the crimes, it was not as conclusive as law enforcement initially believed. However, his arrogance and inexperience as a lawyer did not work in his favor. Ted Bundy was convicted and sentenced to death in the electric chair. In interviews from death row, Bundy spoke coldly about how he chose his victims. "I am not an animal, I am not insane, and I do not have a split personality," he stated.